in ways that will be volatile, politically, culturally, sociologically. And I think that's something we have to take seriously. In this type of work, I think there are in interfaith work, there are two very common beliefs that come up quite a bit. One of them is expressed by people like Huntington, maybe not people who are absolutely towing the line of his thesis, but people who will say this. They will say, the religions of the world and the people coming from the different world religions, the religions are so different. They make such hard and fast claims for truth. You know, the religions are in the truth business. And they don't put a lowercase t on it. They put a capital letter. I mean, they deal with truth in capital letters. Truth for all time, all people, all places. It came down from somewhere, and here it is, and we got to live by it. That it makes such absolute truth claims, and they're so radically different. They're so radically incommensurate that there's no way they can ever really connect. There's no way really that the people from these very different perspectives, say Christianity and Hinduism, or Islam and Buddhism, there's really no way that they can have a strong connection, theoretically or even relationally, because it's just so different. Buddhism, philosophically, is atheistic. It's not about worshiping a god. Buddha is not a god. There's no real god in Buddhism. And then you have Islam, which is monotheism. So how do you put that? So some people say they're just so different, there's really no point. And inevitably, if the conditions are right and if pressure is applied, that difference will boil over into conflict. And more, that seems, people will say that's where it seems to be going. Or that it has to go that way, or that it's sort of inevitable that it'll go that way. I don't think that's necessarily right. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, some people in interfaith work say, oh no, they're not so different. All the religions are really the same. They're all really the same. You know, they change the name for what they mean by God. You know, they have different names for God, different symbols, but, you know, they're really all the same. As a scholar in this business, I just have to say, no, they're not. They're really not the same. They are really different. They are different. What is called God in Hinduism, I'm not sure if the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews would be willing to call that the same as their God. Some religion, you know, you can't even say that all religions worship a God. No, they don't. Buddhism doesn't. Taoism doesn't. Confucianism does not. Certain forms of Wicca do not. Scientology, one of the newest and fastest growing world religions, does not. And so, even on that, there's no agreement. And when they do talk about a God, there's differences in terms of what that is. Differences in terms of the basic questions that religions ask. Who are we? Why are we here? What are we supposed to do now that we are here? Why do we die? What happens when we die? How did we get here? What is this place? I mean, these are the central questions of religion. So if there is any kind of sameness, perhaps we could say all the different religions are asking these questions, these very human questions. Their answers to them are very different. You can't even say that all the religions say we have a soul. We don't have a permanent soul in Buddhism. We don't have a permanent soul in philosophical Taoism. So, they are different. And we have to confront that difference, I believe. So you've got these two perspectives at the end. You know, you've got the extreme, we're all the same, la la la, let's sing, let's hold hands, be friends. And then at the other end, we're so different, don't even bother. So I'm trying to sort of chart a middle ground between those two positions. I think both of them are problematic. Both of them really can't be defended completely. I think there's maybe another way, a way to acknowledge profound difference, but that it's not so different that we can't find some point of connection. When I look at Huntington's work, I think there are a few points that, there's a lot of points, but for our purposes today, when I think about the issues that I'm concerned with, there are 3 points I think that he makes that are worth mentioning for us. He ends up being sort of the whipping boy of people who care about interfaith dialogue. You know, he's like the boogeyman, you know, oh, bad Huntington, he says we're going to end up in violence, and bad thesis of Clash of Civilizations. I don't think he's all bad. I think there are some points in his work that are important. We can quibble with his methodology, with some of his theoretical constructs. That's boring to me. The ultimate thesis, you know, I think there are some things that are worthwhile. One thing that I really think is important that he brings out, he talks about the us versus them. He uses that sort of that language, the us versus them mentality that can develop when we identify ourselves exclusively and deeply within a civilizational identity. For example, he identifies a handful, 7 or 8 major civilizations. The Western civilization, the Confucian, the Japanese, the Islamic, the Hindu, the Slavic Orthodox, the Latin American, and then he says possibly African. But the reason he kind of holds out on Africa is because Africa's so big and it's got so many different countries and cultures, he doesn't really know if it's fair to lump all of that under one civilizational tag. Okay. So if we think about it, his point is if we identify ourselves exclusively within one of those civilizational tags and don't ever really think of ourselves outside of it, then by definition that sort of sets us up into a dichotomy where it's us and everyone who's like us versus them and all those other people. So there's only really 2 ways to be, like us or not us, otherwise them. And it just sets up a dichotomy from the beginning. It's a simple monolithic identity that doesn't understand complexity, that doesn't see that, for example, to talk about the West, here we sit in the West, and we've got the whole Western tradition of art and music and philosophy and thought and science. Was all that created by people who lived in the West? I mean, properly? No. We wouldn't have much of what we call Western science without several centuries of Islamic preservation of Greek knowledge, Greek classical knowledge from Aristotle and the classical Greek period. So even West, when we say, well, I'm Western, that's a rigid monolithic identity that if you scratch it a little deeper, it's way more complicated than we often think that it is. But it's convenient to forget that when, God forbid, some horrible thing happens. A 9/11, some horrible episode like that happens, and everybody gets scared and shocked, and you retreat into these very simple identities out of fear and out of safety. So, I think he's right to point this out, that this is a real mechanism that happens. It happens at a political level, a social level, a cultural level, at a psychological level. I believe there is no future for us in a world of people running around with rigid, monolithic identities. There's no future. That is a future of violence and bloodshed. So anything that we can do to complicate that, to disrupt that easy, convenient dichotomy that says us versus them, anything we can do to disrupt that, I think is helpful, very helpful. And I think Huntington is trying to point that out. He identifies, when he defines the West, he lays out certain things that define the Western civilization, things like individualism, liberalism, like classical liberalism focused on freedom, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, democracy, rule of law, free markets. Certainly you can look historically and see that many of those things did develop in the West. Certain forms of free market capitalism, other types of things, certain kinds of democracy, but not democracy itself. I mean, democracy itself is, 2,500 or more years old and didn't come up in the West. Notions like the rule of law and human dignity, the West does not have a monopoly on these ideas. I think Huntington plays a little bit too fast and he's a little bit myopic on these issues. When you look at some of these, the ways in which he defines these major civilizational tags, I think there's a little bit of narrowness in his vision. So it requires that different world civilizations and cultures that will speak about human dignity, freedom, equality, things like that, from within their own traditions and within their own rubric, and that the West does not have a monopoly or a lock on these notions. And to say that we do begins to set up that us versus them mentality. So it's something to be careful about. It's something to be alert about if in our analysis, in our thinking, we begin to think that way and to say, well, the West really has it, the best ideas are in the West. I don't think you can defend that really, even historically in terms of the history of ideas. There's a quote that I really like from him, a way that he ends his essay, and I really like this quote, so I just want to read it to you in terms of sort of what some of the work I think is required for us to do. And this is just a direct quote from his piece. The West must develop a more profound understanding of the basic religious and philosophical assumptions underlying other civilizations and the ways in which people in those civilizations see their interests. It will require an effort to identify elements of commonality between Western and other civilizations. For the relevant future, there will be no universal civilization, but instead a world of different civilizations, each of which will have to learn to coexist with the others. He's rejecting this notion of just one big universal civilization. I think he's probably right to reject that. I think that's probably naive. It's a utopian sort of vision. It's not one that's going to work in the real world of social, political, and cultural life. And I think he's right to put, at least in his language, to put some of the burden, he's phrasing it with the burden on the West. That it's the West that needs to go out and understand, to try to do this. I think that's right at the moment, at our current moment in time. The West is culturally dominant in the world. This country that we're in right now is culturally dominant. We are a superpower. We do not colonize in the way the British did. We do not imperialize in the way that Rome did. But it's a very subtle type of cultural kind of domination. This country and the West in general still dominates many of the financial and the security and other economic institutions that govern the world. And it's just real easy for us to just run over everyone. And then those other civilizations and groups resist that, often by appealing to deep civilizational identities. And then it creates this very possibility for clash that Huntington is talking about. So I think the one that happens to be dominant in this time, which is the West, that's the one on whose shoulders it falls to make this extra effort, to try to understand these other civilizations and work with them in ways that are not oppressive or violence-producing. I don't know about oppressive, but violence-producing, in ways that can ease a relationship and can make things work a little better. I don't like the word sameness. You know that, for example, Buddhism and Christianity are the same on this, or Hinduism and Islam are the same on this. They're not the same. Nothing is the same. And so the word that I've used in the book is resonance. Resonant. Things can resonate with each other. And that's a musical term. Some of you musicians. It's a musical term. If you have a 3-note chord, you've got 3 very distinct notes. But if you play them in a certain way, there's a kind of resonance that happens. At other times, there's dissonance. But there can be some resonance. In such a way that even the dissonance can sometimes be okay in the larger scheme. We've all listened to music that has deliberate dissonance in it. And that can be workable. So I like the word resonant because it retains the distinct features of all the things that are involved, but it points out that there is a possibility for a connection or a relationship that can be workable and